Now, when you think about it, there are people who tend to be much more sensitive to the presence of non-physical beings. And so they are able to not only sense their presence or a shift in the energy in the space they're in, but they can have really deep personal relations with it. For other people, that's more difficult. Oh, some would say it's a lack of faith, but most of you, if you've been around me for any time at all, know I don't ask you to have faith in anything, except maybe other than your spiritual path. You do have to take confidence in that, because if you doubt it, or if you are suspicious about it, then not much progress is made. But the faith you have is in the fact that it has worked for so many other people before you. And therefore it will work for you as well. Now, many people do have faith, sometimes in various deities, sometimes in, let's say, various teachers, sometimes in what they call the divine, whether it's God the Father or God the Mother. For some people, that is easier than others. And then there are always those whose minds tell them, well, if things aren't perfect and beautiful, that's God's fault, or whoever's in charge of this mess. Well, I have some news for you. You're in charge of the mess. Humanity, you see, is driving the change that is coming forth right now. And frankly, it has kind of some tricky places. And it has some places that are not very pretty. The whole idea, of course, is to step above or beyond or out of warring mentality. But you see, warring mentality isn't something that just occurs to the people who have guns and tanks and aircraft that drop things or missile launchers. Those are the outward results of warring mentality. But warring mentality itself can be found in the presence of greed and aversion. It may be found in the presence of delusions as well. And as you know, those are the three categories of mental afflictions. You know, you can suffer because you want something so badly. Maybe it's a person you're in love with. And if that person isn't in love with you, the desiring can be very, very strong. And maybe you even do something you later wish you hadn't done because you want that person in your life. Or perhaps you want that amount in your bank account, or you want that particular car, or whatever. And so people suffer because they don't have what they want. You can't change that by getting more stuff. Some think you can, but everyone that tries that recognizes it doesn't work because the mind then just fixates on something else. So greed is a huge cause of people's suffering. Another is aversions. I don't like that. And I will not be a part of that. You don't have to be a part of that, but don't so glibly just write off all the people. How is it possible to have a differing opinion and still hold compassion for those who seem to be so at odds with you, or maybe for those with whom you seem to be at odds? And that at oddness arises in many relationships. Certainly it arises in intimate or personal relationships, doesn't it? It arises in relationship between parents and children. It arises in relationships sometimes between employees and their bosses. And what people come back to is, well, I should feel this way because my boss doesn't honor me in this way or that way. And therefore, his or her mistake or mistakenness gives me certain rights to behave in a way that maybe isn't all that holy. So I take pot shots. I talk about them in ugly ways behind their backs. I spread rumors. And I justify it because I am at odds with that person, or perhaps I'm more at odds with his or her beliefs. But you see, disagreements are part of life. Do they, or must they, bring out warring mentality? Where you have to go after the other as if to kill them or to wound them in some primary way. There's a saying that I've heard. I don't hear women use this very much, but I've heard, I do hear some people say, well, if they cross me, I'll cut them off the knees. And if you really let in what that thought is about, technically the person probably doesn't mean they're going to do anything violent. And yet that's the way he or she described what they were feeling in that moment. And it creeps in to such a deep level that most people don't even recognize it. But they just find themselves opposed to everyone around them. The first thing that comes up feels oppositional. Now, I can tell you that is not a peaceful mind. And so what some people do then is they project all of the judgment they feel on the divine. And they think, well, this is the way God feels about humans. We're miserable, we're lousy, we're whatever. So God has the right to punish us and beat us up and so on. And there are even people who believe that so keenly, so strongly. They'll go out in the world and try to be toward others the way they perceive God is to them. But it's really interesting to see how powerful opinions are, isn't it? Many people do not know the difference between an opinion the mind creates and what is really going on, or fact, we could say. The facts are all questionable nowadays. It's a very strange time on earth. People cannot agree on the facts. Although there's a lot of strange stories being perpetrated, and those who perpetrate them generally have an idea that if people can be divided and not experience their commonness or their connection, then they can be manipulated and ultimately taken advantage of. This goes on to some extent in corporate dealings, and it certainly goes on in national dealings. And when you have interference in elections of one country interfering in another, and then frankly, there's been a lot of that in the past. Maybe it was not as covert as it is nowadays when so much of it happens online. But generally speaking, one party only does that to disrupt the other. They have a different belief about maybe, they say this is in your best interest to have this kind of government, but maybe it's in my best interest, you see, as a government over here, or as a potential trade partner or whatever. So we can find flaws and faults with all of it, can't we? We can talk about corporate greed and how that is used to manipulate people. We can talk about that. But it doesn't bring us together to talk about that, does it? It separates us. And there are so many topics on the table today that really separate humans, that cause them not only to be unable to perceive the connection and the oneness, but not to even want to see it, because somehow that greater condition may seem threatening. I may feel threatened that you will overtake me, or that your government will override my government, or that your political agenda will overtake my mind. And so there is this arises a delusional type of thinking. It's called fear. And most people don't think of fear as delusional. They think of it as protective, but you have to be very careful with it. Now, if there is a threat that is arising in the moment, the mind will respond to it by something called fright. If a person is approaching a railroad crossing in their car, and suddenly they're aware that there's a speeding train coming, they may, as they slam on the brakes, feel fright. And there's a reason for that. There was an imminent threat right there. And somehow the fright caused them to somehow avert a tragedy. And all of you have heard it said that the internal mechanism, the emotional body perhaps has three, when something threatening is there, it has three options. It can fight, it can flee, or it can freeze. And often people do one more habitually than others, but sometimes they do a combination. Even though some of those sound like it's impossible to combine. Don't worry about that. They've got a couple of people going off on that. Don't go there. Here's the thing. Fright is what helps you stay alive. Fear doesn't. Fear is where the mind remembers something that happened negatively in the past and projects it into the future. And so fear then, coming from the example we just talked about, might be that the person then decides never to take a route that goes over railroad tracks because there must probably a train there somewhere. Now that's fear. It's a projection. It goes off even when there's no train. And most people listen to it as if it's telling them the truth, even though there's no train. Now, that's maybe a very gross way. And if we look at the much more subtle ways in which the mind works, well, many people are in a state of intense fear right now about nuclear warfare. And while that is a possibility, you must be aware of that, yes. But don't let your precious mind go into fear about it, because the threat isn't, nobody's pushed the button yet. Should that happen, you'll have plenty of time to fear later if you want to fear. But here's the thing. You have to be aware of where your awareness goes. Is it always going to what's wrong, what could possibly hurt you, or what the evil motivations are of other people, other political parties? You have to watch where your mind goes, because your mind is what causes you to suffer.